Good morning, everyone. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today and pay respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This International Women's Day, we bring together three exceptional Griffith alumni for this online event. Australian strategist and researcher Dr Elise Stephenson is Griffith University's 2020 Outstanding Young Alumnus of the Year, having recently completed her PhD at Griffith after lots of other Griffith degrees. She's a postdoctoral fellow at our Policy Innovation Hub. She'll lead the conversation with human rights lawyer, Bachelor of International Relations graduate and Fullbright Scholar Sasha Purcell Whaleboat, and Sir John Monash Scholarship recipient and Master of Global Development Studies student Emily Ragus. They'll be speaking on the topic Women in Leadership, Achieving an Equal Future in a COVID-19 World, sharing the best leadership advice, thoughts on current gender imbalances and strategies for a better future for all women. Now, I'm going to leave the substance mainly to our great panel, but I wanted to note two issues before handing over to Elise. 2020 was a year of extraordinary hardship for many, and the effect of global pandemic has been devastating for women's progress. A recent report co-authored by Griffith University academic Professor Sarah Davies highlighted the impact of COVID-19 on women's well-being and gender equality, and suggests that hard-fought progress is already being wound back. Women's access to education and health services suffered, and their precarious economic security has been laid bare. It's important that research like this continues at Griffith, which is one of the reasons that we've also established the Gender Equality Research Network to showcase research on gender equality, women's leadership and gender inclusivity. Second, we have to continue to walk the walk ourselves too. While there's plenty of work that remains to be done, at Griffith we continue to be an employer of choice for gender equality, an award conferred on us every year since 2001. 61% of Griffith staff today are women, including 55% of executive group, 75% of senior corporate services officers, 49% of senior professional staff, and 45% of senior academic staff. So with those two bits of advice, I now hand over to one of the talented Griffith women, Dr Elise Stephenson, to begin our discussion.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr Elise Stevenson and I'm so thrilled to be here today with Emily Ragus, who is one of our amazing Griffith alumni, remarkable Griffith alumni, some may say. And we're here today to talk a little bit about International Women's Day and have a conversation. Emily, I really wanted to start. What is some of the best leadership advice that you have ever received?
I think for me, I've had an incredibly varied career, and the best leadership advice that I've ever had throughout the different stages of my career have come from the fact that I've had a mentor. So the best advice really was to get a mentor. And for me, that's not just finding somebody who I like, it's finding somebody who will really challenge me, but is incredibly invested in my career and the decisions that I make. And for me, I found that that really pushed me into another level of leadership that I might not have had if I didn't have that support system.
There's so much there around being able to get the support of peers and mentors who may be more senior to you or who might be on the same level who can help guide you through.
Definitely,
now,
yes.
When we talk about 2020, obviously was a really big year, but for you, what were some of the 2020 achievements that we can celebrate? And is there any momentum that we could build on?
Yeah, I think, the adversity of 2020, not only within Australia, but globally, has really pushed a period of social change. So COVID-19 has brought about these aspects of inequalities that we always knew were there, but it has now increased to these really dramatic and very obvious levels within society. So I believe that although it's been an incredibly difficult year and it's going on into 2021 as well, I do think that we're now really focusing on some of the ways that we can change. And that's on the back of, some of the big, strong social justice movements that we've seen. So we've had the Me Too movement, we've had the Black Lives Matter movement, and we've also had a big, strong focus on climate change. And I think by having those open dialogues from those big social movements, then we've been able to push through and look in our own backyard at the inequality. And for me, I feel that 2020 is going to change the social landscape and the way we think about things. Obviously, there's a fear of a nationalistic behaviour that can happen with closing borders and things like that. But what I believe that what that has done is it's pushed us into a period of innovation that we've had to use to combat the situations of not being able to leave our own backyard and our home. So I feel that as far as the tragedy of 2020 goes, what's going to come out of it is something that could really change the way we think and the way we behave as human beings.
Thank you. I really, really appreciate that perspective, because one of the things that I've definitely noticed is just how much some of those, whether it's Black Lives Matter or climate change, these conversations have come back into the home, and it's come down to a level that maybe wasn't there initially.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that now we have conversations, especially as Australians. Traditionally, we may not have had those conversations sitting and having coffee and having dinner with our family, but we now do that. And I think that that's a really special period of time that we need to focus on and continue.
Totally. So kind of in line with this, if you could do one thing today in pursuit of gender equality that would make a practical difference in the lives of women and girls, what would it be for you?
I think for me, and that is a really tough question, because being a nurse, traditionally, I look at practicality as such an important thing. But I think it's continuing to have these conversations. And I think that it's only through these conversations that we gain a greater understanding of the inequalities that women face, but also an understanding for men as far as what it is like to be a woman, not only in Australia, but globally. So, there are different things that we can do from, a social justice perspective and all of that, but it all comes down to open communication and effective education on these areas.
Completely. And I think one of the things that ties into that is all around empathy and how you can actually understand what it is like to be an individual of whatever background you are, and how that affects you in the world. I mean, we know that there are many different inequalities out there. We know that it's not just around gender, but could be sexuality, could be ethnicity or race or any other form of background. So it really is about being able to connect and have that sort of empathy too.
Completely. And I feel like education is the only way forward in that situation to gain that level of empathy, because you just simply don't understand. If you don't understand, you'll never be able to feel the way somebody else feels.
Absolutely. And it's actually, for me, it really ties in nicely to the next question I had, which was all around, how do you actually engage those who are already in leadership? They have the power to drive change. We know that we need to engage with them to be able to be out there at the front line, making new policies, setting the agenda, being a role model. But how could we engage them? Like, for instance, male champions of change or any other important partners who are out there in leadership positions. How can they contribute, and how would you go about influencing them?
For me, I think it once again goes back to opening that dialogue and starting those conversations and talking about diversity, but also talking about the benefits of diversity, and not only the benefits for women, but the benefits for society, for the economy, and for their own individual organisation. If we have the full extent of both men and women within an organisation making decisions, then we're going to increase our decision making and our problem solving power. I think that people like Jacinda Ardern have really helped shape the perception of different people and different ideas about women and leadership, because she comes at it from quite a feminine and empathetic perspective. And for me, I really feel like that adds such a different element, and that's possibly why she's been considered one of the greatest leaders throughout this period of time, because she's just doing things so differently. And that's what diversity does, is it brings a different perspective and a different idea. Another thing that I think we need to do is I really do think we need to make people accountable for their decision making. And through that is ensuring that they understand what their accountabilities are from a gender equality perspective. So I think it really still comes back down to education.
Yeah, completely. And realizing that it's a long journey, you know, we're not going to get there overnight. It's certainly something that progress can be made and it can be repealed just as quickly. And we've certainly seen that through COVID. We know that most frontline workers, a majority, are women, you know, in healthcare, that have been hit by hospitality, kind of industry, tourism, so on. It really is, you know, it's been a gendered pandemic that we've gone through, and we have seen in political leadership over even a number of countries in our region, like Vietnam, they've actually regressed in terms of women in leadership. So it's almost something that not only involves buy-in and being able to talk about those benefits and partner with people who are in power, but then keep on the pressure. It has to be a continual conversation. It has to be a continual education, you know, and you have to bring you know, not only the generations currently here with us, but the next generations too. How do we bring them on board? And obviously they're quite amazing as it is. But it's a journey to be able to reach out to everyone.
And I think we're really lucky because I feel like the next generation is so passionate about these aspects. And I know that I've learned a lot from my friends who are younger than me because they're so educated, they're so passionate, but they're also really open. And it's an incredible conversation that I'm able to have with them.
Yeah, completely. Myself, I've noticed, you know, looking and talking with a lot of younger people, even a few years ago, I'd say that feminism was considered a bit of a dirty word and you don't want to, you know, identify with that. But I actually think that there's been a great shift now, and we do see feminist leaders, you know, prime ministers and leaders up there in the world. We see feminist foreign policy and domestic policy even, and we're seeing the next generation too really with pride stand up and say, yeah, of course I'm a feminist, because actually we have an awesome world out here and we have such a potential for men, women and anyone in between to be part of that world and creating that future.
Absolutely. I think feminism has almost had a rebranding, and as a result of that, you know, we look at it from the perspective of it being equality, and I think it's so important, and that's why I think it's so important to have male allies who openly say they're a feminist, because it takes away that stigma that had been previously associated with the word. So I think it's great. We're going into an exciting time.
100%, completely agree. Lastly, Emily, I really want to know, you know, what leadership advice would you give in 2021? Is there anything you might tell, you know, the next generation out there, or even anyone watching, things you do, keep an eye on, not do? I'd love to hear.
I think that we've touched on it a little bit already today, but talking about empathetic leadership is really important, because what it does is it makes people comfortable to be led by you. It also ensures that you're bringing about the best benefits of the team and everyone's working to their strengths rather than their weaknesses. Everybody that's part of a team can add value at some point. It's just what value that they can add, and it's up to the leader to try and draw that out. And I think by being empathetic, you're encouraging this really open dialogue. You're encouraging people to feel comfortable, and they're always going to be the best person within that team. So I do think that's important just generally, but then in this instance of this almost global fatigue that we have at the moment associated with COVID-19 and everything that's associated with it, I think we really need to be empathetic and understanding of people's situations. And when you sit there and work at things from an empathetic leadership perspective, people are going to be more open to you about what they're doing and what they're struggling with, so that you can solidify the team and make it a really strong unit.
Completely. Thank you so much, and such sage words to be taking forward. I think that empathetic leadership is going to be integral to our recovery. It will be integral to being able to achieve gender equality across all spheres of our society, and it's really a strong, I guess, a personal development goal that we can all aim for, building empathy and building that into our leadership skill set.
Absolutely, yes.
Well, Emily, I want to thank you so much for spending your time today with us. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you on International Women's Day and hear from your perspectives of leadership and what the next few years perhaps holds. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me today. It was an honour.
And I'm so thrilled to be here today to be talking to Sasha Purcell Whaleboat on International Women's Day 2021. Welcome, Sasha. It's really great to have you here, firstly.
Thank you so much for having me. I really am very excited to be involved.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons I was so excited to speak with you is because we've got a series of questions, and essentially I'd love to just have a really candid and fun chat with you today all around International Women's Day and kind of what can we be looking forward to, what momentum can we build on, and perhaps where do we still need to make some progress. But I wanted to kick us off and talk about and perhaps ask you, for you, what is the best leadership advice you've ever received?
I think the best leadership advice I've ever received are two different things by two different people at two different times in my life. One was to always use your voice for good. So doing nothing is an injustice. So always ensure that you are having momentum and advocacy and what you're trying to achieve in life. The other thing is that someone has said to me, and it sticks with me, is don't let people rent space in your head. So don't let people make you think or challenge your belief of how strong you can be and what you can achieve and what spaces you belong in or where you should be working or what you should be studying. So those two pieces of advice have really kind of stuck with me. So whenever I face adversity, I think of those two things, and I realize I shouldn't be dwelling on negative people or negative comments, but that I should use my position and my voice for good. So I think those are probably those two things that have really stuck with me, and they've been really great mentors.
I really love that. Don't let someone else rent space in your head, because it's so true. I mean, we're at the mercy of all different kinds of ideas and thoughts and people around us, and yet sometimes it can actually detract from our purpose or mission and what is important to us. And I love also that you mentioned around justice. For me, justice has always been an action. It's something that requires doing. It's not just a belief or kind of a principle or value system. And so being able to actually harness that for action is so much so a really important part of leadership.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and for you, I suppose 2020 was a bit of a strange time, but for you, what were some of the achievements that we can celebrate? And were there any things or momentum that we should be building on right now?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so for example, the support for the Black Lives Movement is so important for me as as a Torres Strait Islander, and for someone who is part of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. And in 2020, that movement became a force of resistance. So I'm living in New York at the moment. I'm in Brooklyn, actually. So if I step outside my apartment, I'm surrounded by signs and doors and flags and stickers and artwork about support for the Black Lives movement. And the fantastic thing about this is that it was actually led by women, and women have been leading much of this movement. And it's been focusing the attention on the treatment of Black men and women in the US in relation to police brutality. And worldwide, the influence of the Black Lives Movement was felt in Australia. So it's significant because it's looking at police brutality against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as well. But it's now just worldwide recognized as something, as a force to be reckoned with, really. So I guess that is something good to come out of 2020. Obviously, the trigger for what happened is absolutely devastating and appalling, but the result of it with this movement is something I think we can really advance on in relation to trying to address those social and racist injustices. Another thing I was thinking about is that the Vice President of America is a Black woman. It's incredible. It's I guess it's 2021 technically, because the inauguration was in DC about a month ago. I couldn't go, but it was huge in New York, let me tell you. Everyone was celebrating. So that's another thing. Also, in New Zealand, they had their first Indigenous foreign affairs minister. And so we're looking at Indigenous women and Black women getting into those positions of power. And it's just fantastic to see, because I have a little niece who's 5, and she saw me on TV speaking about an event. She saw my name, Purcell, and she got really excited because that's her last name. And I think about when I was little, there was no one like me on TV. There was no one like me who was Indigenous. And it's hard to be what you can't see. So to see a Black woman as the vice president, to see an Indigenous person as the foreign affairs minister in New Zealand, to see all these incredible women of all different races in positions of power is something that is a gift, I think, because it gives you that confidence that, yes, I belong in that space and I can be there as well. The other thing I found really interesting about 2020 was in relation to period poverty. So this is really important in relation to women and children trying to access education and resources. And there was a young Australian who won the award in relation to her idea of supporting people from impoverished countries, and not even just impoverished countries, but who are in difficult positions, who don't have those resources to be able to help themselves, and then to be able to comfortably attend schooling, comfortably attend to everyday things in life. And I just think that's such a great idea, and it's so important, and there is now more momentum around that as well. So I think there are a lot of really great things to touch on in relation to how women are advancing women.
Yeah, I love that. Oh my gosh, so many different things I could pull on there. In fact, one thing that I love also was that in 2020, or kind of this last 24 months, we've seen some great moves in Australia. For instance, we had Julianne Guevara, the first Indigenous ambassador for gender equality here in Australia, a complete legend. And also Julianne was the first Indigenous ambassador, female ambassador, to have been essentially promoted to this position. And that only occurred in 2018. And when we're having a look at Australian foreign affairs, the fact that it took, over 100 years to get Australia's first Indigenous woman in the position of an ambassador also is mind-blowingly devastating. The potential that we have now and the power that role wields, and also what you were talking about before about role models and being able to essentially be there at the forefront and encourage others, I think is really quite significant. I also love that you talk about that it's often women who lead our big social movements. I mean, we certainly saw it here in Australia around Black Lives Matter and Indigenous Lives Matter. It reminds me of the Pride movement, a few decades ago, which was largely led by trans women. If we look at the HIV/AIDS crisis, there was a lot of amazing lesbian women who are at the forefront of advocating for change. I always find it, I suppose, ironic in a way that women are there at the front. They are often in the position of being most marginalized, but on the other hand, they are also some of the most powerful, and I suppose they are the community. They're right there and they are making change. So it's certainly inspiring from that angle too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. On a side note, I'm very excited because Queensland actually did commit in the last election to providing free sanitary products for schools.
They did.
So
yes, I was going to mention that. I'm actually very impressed that our state has become that progressive, that they're doing that. And I think we should move on that momentum in other aspects as well. I wish I was in Australia this year to be pushing for other social, economic rights that are so important to me. But I mean, so many people are doing so many great things, and I just think use that momentum, because it's very important to grab onto something that we've succeeded and just continue.
Absolutely. And that comes down to the partnerships too. You may be able to lead in one space, someone else is able to lead in another, and you can all support each other, whether that's across climate justice or, period poverty or leadership or anything else. And actually, it ties in. I really want to hear from you. What if you could do one thing today in pursuit of gender equality, maybe prioritize one thing that would make a practical difference to the lives of women and girls? what would it be?
I mean, it's such a big question, and I feel like my answer is just going to make people sigh and go, yes, okay, okay. But honestly, education. And then when I say education, I don't mean you go to school, you learn, you go home, you go to university, you go out into the world. I mean education in every kind of space. I just think access to education, which comes back to the period poverty issue, and the confidence you have as a person, potentially a woman going into law or into engineering or into those spaces where we're not usually seen. We're not potentially wanted, and we're not usually respected. So for me, it's just a matter of getting all those young girls and women educated as much as they can in whatever they want to do and succeeding in the spaces they want to succeed. And so one of my friends is a pastry chef, but she had always been told, you know, it's too difficult, and the hours are going to be long, and it's at night, and how are you going to handle having a family, and she had never inferred that she wanted to have children. She inferred that she had a family with her partner, and that was it, and that she could do this, but people just kind of put her down. And so that's another thing for me, is part of education is educating people on what women can do and achieve and what our rights are. And our rights are as the same as everybody else, to get an education, to do what we want, excel where we want, and be respected where we want. So if I could push for education and the support systems in place that are required, which I wish were there when I was in school, and I say that though, but I'm doing my PhD, so they're kind of there. I think I would say that's it. Education and the support systems that need to be in place. In relation to potentially a support person who's LGBTIQ plus, or who is Indigenous, or who comes from a minority group or a religious group that you're from. It's just that extra support that gives you the confidence to feel like you can excel in what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And education really is the key to that. And I mean, I would add from that angle, I suppose, education for young boys and men too, around gendered issues and just the gendered nature of the world. I mean, it's one of the big things that I often confront when I'm working with big organizations. We might see that the managers or leadership team have had a degree of training around gender equality or sexism or unconscious bias. And yet often the rest of the organization is forgotten about. But when we're looking at organizational culture, whether that is in, you know, a school, whether it's in a, I don't know, wherever you work, actually, a government, business, it actually, culture comes from everywhere, you know, it has to be something that everyone is bought into and something that everyone is aware of, because I think there can be a tendency to think, well, everyone knows of the issues, everyone knows of the solutions, but I think that in many cases, unless you are directly exposed to them, you can go through world unaware of certain privileges, as well as certain, you know, disadvantages that other people may face. So it's,
absolutely. And I was going to comment that there is that aspect of, I would say, white male privilege. And so for them to be educated, that is actually a privilege, and this is how it plays out, and to give them concrete examples. I've seen it several times over. And for them to act in a certain way as a lawyer or a litigator, and as for me to act in a certain way as a lawyer and a litigator in the exact same situation, I would be considered aggressive, whereas they would be considered assertive. So it's those little unconscious biases, maybe conscious biases, that play out all the time in the work that I do. And being me, I have no problem confronting anybody about anything, but it's not a comfortable position, I think, for a lot of people to be in. So there has to be an education around boys and men realizing that if you see harassment in the workplace, or you hear about harassment, you know, take it seriously, see if you can find support for them, or just call it out if you see it and hear it in a workplace. those are basic things that I think we should be doing all the time, that I think women do well, and that I think men are starting to do a lot better.
When we are talking about women's leadership or gender equality, often we actually need to engage those who have the power to drive change. Typically, we know that, still men do occupy a majority of leadership positions across society, across almost every industry. Therefore, engaging male champions of change of all kinds can be important partners. For you, how do you think that they should be contributing? What would you like to see from our male counterparts and allies out there?
In relation to male counterparts and allies, I think it goes back to my last comment, is that I want to see them call out injustice and discrimination and sexism in all capacities. So whether it be in the workplace, whether it be in a university or a school setting, whether it be on the street, whether it be in relation to compensation, and realizing that your counterpart who's a woman is not getting as much as you. You should be the voice of change because you are in a privileged position to be heard. And whether we like it or not, in many spaces, male voice has more authority than a woman's voice. So they must use that voice for good. I come from being a lawyer, and I work in international law and at the United Nations. So there are so many different cultures and so many different ways of looking at the world. So you just have to embrace what you can do and do your best. I always say, when I see something, and in New York they say, if you see something, say something. So it's essentially the same thing. That's what you should do, and just do better. It's my comment.
Love that. It's keep it simple, but that absolutely really resonates too. What leadership advice would you give in 2021?
Oh, 2021 is a crazy, crazy year. So I made it to New York for my Fulbright, and I've been thinking about how I got here. From someone who, wasn't very good at maths in high school, didn't know if I could get the OP I needed to get into law, and working as a waitress and just a customer saying, "Oh, law isn't for girls. It's very hard. I don't think you do well there. Maybe do an arts degree," and then along the way, in the years I've worked in human rights, and now I'm considered an expert at the United Nations in relation to Indigenous human rights, and I'm also doing my PhD in climate change in the Torres Strait. So there's a lot of little steps along the way where people have been naysayers, I guess. And what I've really considered is that be proud of who you are. So I'm really proud of being a Torres Strait Islander. I'm really proud of my background and my family and my culture. I have a very strong upbringing, which I'm very thankful for. But there weren't support systems in the educational spaces that I was in. So I had to create them myself or navigate around them and navigate around the negativity. So honestly, I think my advice would be to take up space. And I mean that figuratively and literally. Go into meetings, be at the table. If you're not invited, just open the door, walk in, sit down. What are they going to do? You should be there. So I think if I can sum it up, my closing statements, as a lawyer, as you would say, is to take up space.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And I think it's so key to where we're going next and being able to, actually be at the table. We know that we're not always going to get an invitation, whether out of, intent or not. And therefore there is a responsibility on us to actually make sure that we make our own space if someone else isn't going to.
Exactly. And the thing that's great about doing that is, although potentially it's uncomfortable for me and it's confrontational and it's difficult, and I get the door hypothetically closed in my face, it makes it easier for the next woman who comes along, because you're setting a precedent for the next woman who comes along to be able to say, well, Sasha got this far. I'm going to see if I can get this far. I've opened the door, but I couldn't get in. But now the door's open and the next person can get in. So that's what it's about. It's about making the journey easier for the next woman that comes along.
Absolutely. And I just think that that's so important for all of us to keep in mind, is that actually just alone, none of us are going to achieve gender equality. It is actually a team effort, at the widest level. And so being able to support those who come after us is just so important as part of that. Sasha, it has been such an absolute pleasure to talk to you today. We really appreciate your thoughts on International Women's Day. We wish you the best of success in the year ahead, and thank you for sharing your time and wisdom with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful.